for Fort St. Angelo. He's also very interested in fortifications, etc., as you'll realize when we start to give you information on the site. Before we go into the fort, it's important that we stay as a group. As you can understand, the fort is in a very depleted state. It's not restored. There are shafts, hidden shafts, which we know about, so keep with us. Matthew will be leading and I will be at the back. Please, if you want to take a photograph, just tell me. We will stop and you will take photographs, etc. But please keep together, as there are areas which are not so safe. Okay? Fine.
Please do understand that we are unable to visit all areas of the fort for health and safety reasons. But rest assured that we will show you around all the most interesting places within Fort Delimara.
If you have torches, later on when we go into the tunnel, you will have to use them.
So, can we proceed a bit to this way, please? Going to do the introduction here, but Mario took the spotlight to himself. I'm Matthew Balzan. Before going inside, I would like to start from here for a reason, in order to explain and understand the reason why Fort Delimara was constructed. Fortifications cannot be seen on their own, just simply their architecture, but you have also to take the context which surrounds them, particularly the geographical context which surrounds the fortification. And in fact, Fort Delimara was constructed for a very simple reason: to defend and safeguard the entrance into Marsaxlokk Bay, which by the mid-19th century was heavily unfortified, except for St. Lucian Tower, which in the 1860s was adapted with a heavy casemated battery in front, which you can see from here. However, with the progress of artillery, the progress of naval technology, with warships becoming ever more powerful, the British forces realized they needed something else, something more modern, to defend the entrance to this bay, which was the most adapted for an enemy power, should they invade Malta, to come in with their ships and even land their troops here. Marsaxlokk Bay, together with Benghisa Bay, offer wide space, as you can see, with adequate berths where literally ships can go within few meters of land. And therefore, from the 1870s, the British decided to defend better this bay. This was not also to be seen on its own. Not only this bay, the 1870s marked a series of Victorian fortifications being constructed around the Maltese islands. In fact, the last one was in 1910, Fort Benghisa, on the other side of this harbour, so to completely guard its entrance. And the reason why the British started to modify Malta's fortification system and upgrading it considerably was for two reasons. First of all, Malta by the 1870s became a chief coaling station following the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, and that made Malta an important, a vital stepping stone in the new route to India. And secondly, by 1871, there was the unification of Italy, which for the British, although they had supported the Italian cause for unification, they realized they have a new potential enemy. Because of course Italy, lying only a few miles away, and also Italy immediately upon its unification started with a grand, very vast program of constructing a navy, and that lit up a red bulb at the back of the minds of the British, which they started to see Italy as a potential enemy should any war ever broke out. The late 19th century was a turmoil century, with all major powers in Europe studying each other, and that was actually the initial starting point, which ultimately led in 1914 to the outbreak of World War I. Now, enough on the context. We go more in detail about Fort Delimara. Fort Delimara is as a personal opinion, one of the most beautiful Victorian pentagonal forts in Malta, and in fact, however, from this period, from the 1870s, from the start of the construction of the Victorian fortifications, we start to see a rapid shift in the architecture of fortifications. Fortifications stand on three pillars, which are architecture, that is the way a fortification is built, art, literally how to make a fortification more beautiful, and technology, the way you are arming the fortress. This trident of fortification was in its apex during the hospitallary period. For example, if you see Fort Manuel, you can see the maximum of these three pillars of fortification. But by the 1870s, two of these pillars were rapidly, one of them was already out of the way, the other one was rapidly being discarded. Those are art. As you can see, there is no Baroque decorations or any other things which make the fort pleasant. Something you like seeing, for example, St. John's Cathedral facade. There is not that. So art was already being discarded from the design of fortifications. In the same way, architecture from now, at this point in time, was halfway through on its way out, because fortifications by this time started to be sunken low in the ground, and they also became camouflaged. If you go on Google Maps is an excellent viewpoint of Victorian fortifications. You will notice that if you fill up the ditch around the Victorian fortifications, you will literally not see it. They were constructed for a purpose, not to be seen. Of course, at that time there was no aircraft, but still, that would make them very difficult to see from the seaward side. However, on the other hand, the third pillar of fortification was given the maximum attention, that is technology. By this point in time, it was no longer that the fort is the most important thing, but it's the gun. It's the armament which is the most important. It is not the gun is an extension of the fort, but by now it is the fort which is an extension of the gun. The fort is only there to safeguard the guns, to safeguard the ammunition and the armament inside. Nevertheless, fortifications also had to defend themselves. And in fact, Fort Delimara can be seen in two aspects. As I've explained, there is the defense of the bay, which I will go into more detail when inside, but then there was also the defense of its own. And that was provided primarily by the ditch, which is rock cut going all the way through four sides of the fort. Of course, the fifth side is the cliff. And then there was also the musketry parapet, which you can see above. Those loopholes on the wall above the glacis, and those were there for a purpose, so that soldiers would defend the fort itself should it be invaded by an enemy force. In fact, inside, a fortification would be divided between men of artillery and men of infantry. The artillery would man the guns, the infantry would defend the fort against a direct assault. I think we can go inside, because sun is becoming hotter as well. Before going inside, if you look on your left, you can see another defensive structure which is intended to defend the fort should be attacked by an assault. There are four loopholes there. That is part of a counter-scarp gallery. And the counter-scarp gallery literally means a gallery which is defending the ditch. And in fact, all areas of the ditch are defended by one counter-scarp gallery. Those are ones at Fort Delimara are quite specific, quite unique. They are spread on two levels. That is the upper level we are seeing, where soldiers would defend by the use of rifles. However, the lower level was guarded, was armed with a 32-pounder smooth-bore breech-loading gun. It was literally a gun to defend the ditch. And of course, that same system was repeated on all other four sides. The fort was also originally served with a gantry bridge. Of course, the stone bridge we see today is a gate. It is mainly wooden, but then protected with a sheet of wrought iron in order to make it bulletproof. There would also be the wicket gate. Of course, for security reasons, the full gate would never be open, in the exception when provisions and munitions are coming inside. Else, it would only be the wicket gate which would be open. Of course, so not to fully expose your main accessway, your main gateway into the fortification. On your right, you can also see some other musketry loopholes specifically intended to defend the entrance into the fort. This way, please. Please, when going inside, be careful, mind your head. Now, Fort Delimara was entirely connected by a system of underground passageways, covered passageways, which go all around, connecting all the different sides of the fortification. In fact, this is another notion in regards to what I've explained outside, that by this time, fortifications started to be literally sunken underground. In fact, Fort Delimara, as you will see, is partially cut in rock, not actually built. Even when we will go into the casemates to see the guns, do look at this side and you will notice that there is about this level, about 1.2 meters, which is literally cut in bedrock and not big. Of course, that would limit expenses, and it is more defendable, of course. Now, we can proceed this way, please. Within the inside of the fortification, we will not go farther than here, because for health and safety reasons there are several exposed shafts and cisterns, and of course they might pose some danger. However, from here you can understand a thorough look of Fort Delimara. Now we'll also be going upstairs on the glacis, and I'll also show you several gun emplacements rather than the 38 tons, which I'm leaving the cherry on the cake for the last one. Some general descriptions of Fort Delimara. The first proposal arose in 1873 when the Defence Committee noted it was necessary to defend Delimara Point to better safeguard Marsaxlokk Bay. In fact, by that time, on site, there was still one of the 13 towers built by Grand Master Martino de Reading between 1657 and 1659. Of course, by that time, this type of fortification, which on its own was never intended as a battery, but rather than as a watch post, was completely obsolete. Fort St. Lucian was only partially adapted, and in fact, the first proposal to defend this area was called for a fortification heavily armoured with 5 coastal guns and another 5 64-pounders defending the landward approach. As I've explained earlier, the defence between the outer approach, the outer defence, and the defence of the fort itself. There were several proposals. By 1875, it was decided that 6 guns were enough to defend to arm Fort Delimara, and in fact these 6 guns were completely intended to defend the approaches. So no guns were in place by the time that Fort Delimara was constructed to defend the landward approaches. As I've said, the landward approaches were only to be defended with infantrymen through the musketry, parapet, and counter-scalp galleries, etc. Works on Fort Delimara started in January 1876, and they were complete in December 1878. However, you might have noticed that the gate shows 1881. That is the date when the gatehouse was completed. In fact, it's a common practice. It was a common practice that the date would show the construction of the gate per se, and not the whole fortification. Because normally the gate would be one of the last things to be constructed. And there was a very simple reason for that, because before you construct a gate, you had to get the guns inside. And that would explain the mystery on how guns pass through smaller doors. The fort came at a cost of around £22,353, which was quite a substantial sum of money for that time. Of course, it was designed by the Royal Engineers, and by 1878, the main fabric of the fort was complete. However, by time the fort underwent several structural changes. First of all, however, before explaining something about the structural changes, do note that the internal side of Fort Delimara misses a keep, in contrast with the other Victorian fortifications. For example, if you look at Fort Mosta, you will notice a huge keep, a huge separate structure within the fortification. The same in other forts. The reason why Fort Delimara was not given a keep is because uphill there is Fort Tas-Silġ, which was constructed in 1875, which in its own, since it stands on a higher ground than Fort Delimara, could serve as the keep of Fort Delimara as well, rather than the keep on its own as well. By a keep, we mean that it is the last defensible place, and it is also a guard post from where you can see and protect the lower parts of the same fortification. And of course, by that time, gun technology was adequate enough that from Fort Tas-Silġ you could easily defend the internal side of Fort Delimara should the enemy take a foot in. As I've said, the several structural changes which went about Fort Delimara, the first one was in 1892, when by then gun technology, artillery made more progress, and in fact by the late 1880s there was the introduction of the breech loading gun, which revolutionized the way guns were seen beforehand. The breech loader, that simple description means that the gun was now loaded from the rear and not from the muzzle, not from the front. That facilitated, fastened the loading process, so guns could fire at a higher rate. Also, it eliminated the need for big guns. There was also the introduction of different propellant rather than normal gunpowder, which that meant that with a smaller ammunition you could do the same effect as an 800-pound shell. And of course there was the reason of expense. Rifle muzzle loading guns were very, very expensive, and with the introduction of the breech loaders, the expense was cut also considerably. And in fact, in 1992, Fort Delimara was equipped with 3 gun emplacements for 3 different breech loaders, which were 2 6-inch and 1 9.2 inch, and these were both the larger caliber breech loading guns to be in use at the time. These used hydraulic disappearing mounts, so the gun would be positioned in an emplacement, in a circular emplacement, I'll show you one later on, and literally it would be hoisted with hydraulics, fire and then load, and you have always this process. Of course that would give protection to the gun crew working on the gun. However, by 1906 Fort Delimara was losing its purpose. Guns were ever more progressing, and in fact, for example, in 1905 there was the last practical firing of the 100-ton gun, which became obsolete. It was a rifled muzzle loader. It was, although so big, it was ineffective against modern armaments. And the same happened to Fort Delimara. In fact, in 1910 there was a proposal to upgrade the breech loading gun emplacements. Instead of 3, they were decreased to 2, but they were both armed with the 9.2-inch breech loading gun. The last modification to Fort Delimara happened in 1938, when the 2 9.2-inch breech loaders were removed, and instead there were brought 2 6-inch breech loaders from Fort Benghisa to be in use during World War II. And in fact also that battery, it's a battery command post actually, it's not a pillbox. It is there specifically to work, to help the aiming and working of the guns. In fact, from there it's the highest point of the fort, where they would have a wide arc of visibility, and from there they would calculate, of course, the angle of depression of the guns, the projection, and all which was necessary in order to fire the guns. Of course, only the breech loaders. By that time, by World War II, the 38-ton muzzle loaders were completely obsolete. And in fact, as happened in other places. I think that the only reason why these guns are still here is because it would be too much expensive to try and get them out back again and put them to scrap. And so they would leave them here. In fact, even, for example, the 100-ton gun, which I've mentioned, that is the principal reason why it's still there. Because when they scrapped the other one, which was at Fort Cambridge, the expense was so high, they said, we'll just leave the other one there. Any questions? A casemate means a vaulted structure, a barrel vaulted structure, and of course those would be done for technology of the time, bomb-proof. At the far end, you can see also a casemated structure with a door in the middle and two small ventilation holes on the side. That is one of the expense magazines within Fort Delimara. In fact, Fort Delimara had enough room for 1,510 barrels of gunpowder, with also enough space for 400 rounds of artillery, 400 shells. But of course I will go into more details on this regard when we are near the guns. So, if there are no questions, we can expense magazine, gunpowder expense magazine. We can proceed up the stairs.
The way to go, just follow him.
This is one of the entrance to the underground communication passages which connect all of Fort Delimara underground. But we'll see parts of this system of communication where we are beneath near the gatehouse. Before proceeding, I would like to explain something for your own health and safety. So I'll wait for the others to come up. Up the stairs, we'll just pass to the doorway and then we'll be out on the open again. Please avoid touching the corner because it has a huge crack. So please, for your own health and safety, do not touch that corner, please. This way. Please stay away from the edges. Here we are near one of the gun emplacements of the 6-inch breech loaders which were in place during World War II. So these were a bit different than the ones used beforehand in 1892 and 1913. Of course, the gun would be in the middle on its carriage, on its mounting, and then there would also be in the vicinity the access hatches for the ammunition to be brought up and loaded in the gun. Of course, by this time, the guns would be using ready-made cartridges. No longer you would load with first the shell and then the gunpowder cartridge, but now you would have a metal cartridge which in its own holds both the shell head and also the propellant to fire the shell. Similar to a bullet, to a normal rifle bullet, but on a larger scale.
Those dar kan ġellenta kien jżejnu b'dak ir-ram. Dawk x'kienu?
Dawk ħafna minnhom huma tal-anti-aircraft.
Mhux ta' dawk.
Le, mhux ta' dawk, minnhom huma tal-heavy anti-aircraft. Jew 3.7 għandi minnhom kellna minnhom il-kbidi. Ma kien miż-żgħar tal-Bowforce.
Ejja, dak m'għandix ħaġa minnhom dak ukoll.
Ħafna dak kienu jistabu ħafna fil-gwerra. Coastal guns were not used during World War II, with the exception of the Barketti attack in July 1941. That was the only time.
Bil-ġambol, għabaddi jommi. Isma, ġifi dawn hidden cannons id-din, dajdhom hidden cannons.
Disappearing cannons.
Disappearing cannons.
Of course, from here you can see better the approaches to the bay. You can understand the importance of Fort Delimara. to safeguard the entrances into Marsaxlokk Bay. And in fact, the gun embrasures below were constructed in such a way that they would literally cover all immediate areas of Fort Delimara. On the other side, there is another gun emplacement for the breech loader, but we cannot go there since it would require going through the internal section, which, as I've said, is filled with several exposed shafts and cisterns. From here, we'll proceed from behind the gatehouse down by next to the musketry parapet, and then we'll go below into the gun casements. So follow me, please. Above the first two gun embrasures of the 38 tons, I stopped here because this is the only part which is as originally intended. Although, as I've explained, Fort Delimara was all connected with underground passageways, the areas immediate to the rear of the guns were left exposed for as a smoke escape area. Because, of course, the guns, when fired, would create a huge amount of smoke, and so the rear parts would be left open, so for smoke to rapidly go out. In fact, it was then partially roofed over in later years. In fact, all other smoke escape areas were roofed over by the British during the modifications of the 1890s and also 1930. This way, please. I forgot to show them earlier. These are two, if I stay here, two artistic reconstructions of Fort Delimara. Above is 1892, so note the major difference. First, in 1892, you had 3 gun emplacements for the breech loaders, 2 6-pounders and 1 9.2. By 1913, that was changed to the present configuration with only 2 emplacements, first having the 9.2 inch and then the 6 inches breech loaders during World War II. In fact, note also the change in the gun positions near the gatehouse where we are standing right now. In 1890, the area also had a Maxim machine gun to defend the gateway, and there was also a proposal for another emplacement of a 38 ton, but it was never put in place. In fact, I assume that the pivot behind you was one of the original proposals, but the gun was never mounted. Thank you. This way, please. The gun casemates. These are the first 2. No longer armed with the 38 tons, the remaining 4 guns are in the other vaulted embrasure and the other casemates. Of course, each of the casements would be protected by a heavily armored wrought iron plate, which will protect the opening of the embrasure. There would only be the porthole in the middle, which would be open for the gun to be put in firing position, and then, of course, firing the shot. Above, you would have, for example, there are those hangers above. Those would be used to hoist, to store the sidearms, the long wooden tools which were used for the loading procedure of the gun. A rifled muzzle loader had a rigorous process, but I will better explain it next to one of the guns. underground magazines, which of course would supply the guns with ammunition, and this would be divided with the cartridge store, which is here. In fact, there is still the issue hatch from where the gunpowder cartridge would be supplied. Of course, it would be quite next to impossible to lift that cartridge. Each cartridge would weigh 130 pounds. Also, these chambers are equipped with several lighting windows, and in fact, if you look through one, you can see that the lighting window connects, goes through the wall, and that's for a reason, because these would be protected with, of course, glass on each side. However, they would be opened to change, to be served with, to be resupplied with oil, etc., from the outer side. The inside part will never be open, of course, because to expose a naked flame when you have more than 1,000 pounds of gunpowder would be quite a suicidal attack on purpose. So you would only open from this side and change the oil lamps from the other side. The other sections include, of course, you have the passageways, and they include also the ammunition stores. Of course, the ammunition store would be the section nearest to the gun, since it was the most heavy. Each shell of the 38 tons would weigh up to 800 pounds. So we're talking about 400 kilos each shell. And of course, you'd have the issue hatch as well, directly into the passageway, to the rear of the casemate, with a system of trolleys to take the ammunition next to the gun to be loaded. So here we are next to the first 38-ton gun. This gun was designed by the Royal Gun Factory. It entered service in 1875. It was manufactured by the Royal Arsenal. At one point in time, it was the largest gun in service. In fact, then it was only upgraded with the 100-ton gun in the late 1870s and the early 1880s. However, there was also the 80-ton RML, but that was restricted in the British forces for the Navy. In fact, there were only 4 80-ton guns which were mounted on HMS Inflexible, which was launched in 1876. So, the gun is made up of wrought iron. Wrought iron was an adaptation of cast iron, which is much more harder, it is much more easier to produce, and therefore here we are seeing the effects also of the Industrial Revolution. Effort was not only being taken in the system a gun is being fired, but also in the material it is made up of, to literally mass producing artillery, mass producing guns. Wrought iron. It is mounted on a 6-foot recoil carriage. In fact, here the gun is on its retreated position. Of course, when a gun fires, it would go back with a fast movement known as the recoil, and that would be served. In fact, here you can still see them still in place. Hydraulic cylinders which will absorb the effect of, like a shock absorber of a car, which will absorb the effect of recoil. Those are these two. 6 foot. Of course, the carriage would also be a bit inclined upwards, also to slow the recoil movement. These guns are rifled muzzle loaders. Rifled muzzle loaders means they are first of all loaded from the front, from the muzzle. Rifling means the inside of the barrel is made of a set of grooves going in a spiral way, that will allow the shell, now a pointed projectile, no longer a spherical shot, to go out, turning on its own axis, and that would increase its accuracy and also the range. So it's in effect Yes, for the rate would increase considerably. Yes, it would go out spinning, so to be also more accurate. However, do note that guns, the rifle muzzle loading guns, to have the maximum effect needed to be large for a simple reason. Since the guns at the time were still loaded from the muzzle, you would experience a lot of energy loss. The gunpowder effect, when fired, much of the energy which is produced when gunpowder is lit up would literally escape. And therefore, guns needed to be larger to be loaded with ever more increasing amount of gunpowder. Why so? Because the barrels were short. The barrel is only 5 meters. All right, only 5 meters. But when comparing it with the size of the gun, it is short for a simple reason, because since the guns were loaded from the front, it was impossible to have a casemate double the size to allow a larger gun. Because of course, the larger the barrel, the more the range. And therefore, what they lacked in length, they had to make up in mass. And that's why the guns are so huge. Since the barrels were short, you needed even more gunpowder to have the same effect. And in fact, that was one of the main progress registered with the introduction of breech loaders. The breech loaders were much more thinner. They did not need space since they were loaded from the back, from the rear, and therefore the barrel could be longer. And with a smaller shell, you could have the same effect. The gun, of course, as I said, fired through the heavily armored embrasure. The system of loading. To load, the gun would be turned on one side, mostly facing the barrel, the muzzle facing the right side. Ammunition would come in. I don't know how they used to do it, but there is photographic evidence which shows this. The guns were loaded by hand. Maybe there was some system of jacks and other tools to help lift the shell, an 800-pound shell, but we have photographs of Fort Delimara armed in the late 1890s, which show the sidearms, which were stockpiled hanging on the ceiling, and these would be long wooden tools used to load the gun. You would have, for example, the worm, which would be used to check that the gun is empty. It would be also in a spiral shape to take out any remnants of the cartridge, because the gunpowder cartridge, at the time would still be in silk bags, and so when burned, you could still have some debris, and if you immediately load the next cartridge, you would risk blowing up the whole gun. Then they would insert the cartridge first, using a ramrod to push the cartridge up. Next goes the shell, and the shell would literally be inserted like a screw. In fact, shells had studs to fit with the rifling, and this was done in order to try and keep as much as possible the energy inside, so not to have any vents from where energy can escape. Between one firing and the other, they would also make use of the sponge. The sponge would be made of wool. It would be dipped in water to, of course, extinguish any remaining burning remains of the cartridge before the next loading. The loading process would take about 4 or 5 minutes for each shot. And in fact, it was also another rapid improvement with the breech loaders, when then guns started to become even quick firing. That means some guns were even capable of firing more than 60 rounds a minute, for example. Of course, this was by time more in the early mid-20th century. But the breech loaders, in the case of the rate of fire, it increased considerably as well. These shells, these guns fired 3 types of shells, all made of cast iron. The difference was there was the normal explosive shell, which would be hollow from the inside, filled with explosives. When it hit something, it would literally explode. Then there was also the Palliser shot. The Palliser would be half and half. The front half, the tip, would be solid, and it would have less explosives at the rear, but it had a piercing effect. And this was the main shell to be used against ships, because by the time ships were heavily armored with iron, and therefore the job of the Palliser shot was with the tip, with the solid part, it would pierce the armor, it would get stuck in the ship's armor and then explode to maximize the damage. The third type of shell was the shrapnel shot. This would be also hollow, but inside it would be filled with small lead balls, and it was more anti-personnel. So when it would explode, these lead balls would go out, and who's in their way would end up.
Has it been used in action?
No, they were never used in action. Something else which I forgot to mention is that by this time, guns were not done in a single, manufactured in a single shape, in a single form. So it would have the barrel alone, and then it would be cladded with the outer parts, of course, to make it more strong. And that's why, of course, the back part of the gun would be so huge, so to resist the firing of gunpowder. The main range of use, which would cause the main damage, would not exceed 3,000 yards. So that is half the maximum range. The shell would go out at a speed of 1,400 feet per second. Roughly, about 1,400 feet per second. Around 430 meters per second. Yeah, no, in fact it would be on... they would have a pivot in the front, and then two sets of wheels in the back. Arcs, yes. So sort of arcs, and then it would rotate on rails, yes. But on here, there is some. Yes, there is. Maybe. Yes, they are headed, yes.
Provide something.
I invite you to also come and join Armament and all our activities if anyone is interested. Tonight is the last performance of 1565, First and Last Hope. It is a play which is at Fort St. Elmo. It is not a stage play, so we walk around the fort explaining recounting the history of the Great Siege, the main events of the Great Siege. I'll be one of the actors as well, so we have an extra reason why that starts at 9 p.m. It starts at 9 p.m. was for the second of yours. Yes, you guys buy tickets from the gate. There are only about 300 places available, but I know that there are still some available. So if you come at the gate for Center, for sure you'll be able to. This is the last representation yesterday. Thank you again.